Thank you. So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Sharon Looney, and I'm CHRO with a company in Ireland. We're headquartered. We're a technology company specializing in the development and sale of HR technology. But I suppose one of the first things that I wanted to mention here today is that I'm not here to represent HR technology. I'm not here to represent my company. I'm here to I suppose, just share my experiences as a HR professional around this infamous topic of HR credibility. And I suppose maybe exploring and taking the next 20 minutes, because I've been told my time is down to 20 minutes, so I talk a lot, so this is going to be a little bit of a challenge for me, so you will need to keep time on me. And just really to explore with you guys how we can, as HR professionals, begin to first of all, understand where does the HR credibility gap come in our organizations, and to maybe help us to move the needle on that dial internally within our own organizations. I've worked in India. I worked in Kerala in Cochin for 4 years, so I know Indian culture very well. I love being to India. And I've been to the HRD Congress for the last 3 years. This is my 3rd year attending and speaking at the conference, so it's always a privilege to be invited to return. So first, before we get into the actual whole topic of HR credibility and the gap that exists, I mean, how many of you in this room worry about the HR credibility gap yourselves within your own organizations? Okay. As I said, I've worked for all of my life in HR, and I've worked across 32 countries, across 7 different industry sectors, and it's always been the question. It's always been something that we find ourselves justifying. It's always something that we struggle with from a HR functional perspective. You know, you look at the CIPD in my side of the world, the Chartered Institute of Professional and Development, you know, they're constantly talking about the HR credibility gap. So I think it's time for us now as a profession. And how many students? Do we have students from the universities in the room? Fantastic. You're very welcome. There's going to be some very specific messages for you in this presentation. And so, understanding the HR credibility gap, we must first identify what are the distinctive hallmarks, because irrespective of which country you're working in, irrespective of which industry you work in, for me, in my experience as a HR professional, I'm seeing that there are very distinctive hallmarks as to what actually causes the question of HR credibility inside our organizations. The first up is our HR language. And let's face it, we do tend to speak our own language in HR. We do tend to have our own lingo that we fail to educate the rest of the business on. And therefore, as we speak about our own little initiatives and projects going on, we're all the time speaking in HR language. And speaking HR language inside our organizations is perfectly fine if we're bilingual, and if we can also speak the language of the business, the language that leaders are using inside our businesses every day to assess, to analyze the health and the performance of our business. So unless we're bilingual, we have our HR language, but we also need to have and become fluent in the language of the business, and to be able to translate and vice versa. So us sitting at the table, understanding and speaking the language of the business, but also taking it upon ourselves and taking the lead to educate other leaders within the business who don't necessarily have HR backgrounds. So that's point number 1, and that is probably one of the single biggest hallmarks of the HR credibility gap, where we continue just to speak our own language and don't translate what we're speaking about to other leaders in the business. Second is the HR alignment. We are and can be constantly accused of being on our own train track, in our own carriage on the train, where we're, aside from all of the other organizational initiatives going on, HR are carrying on with their own initiatives, their own projects, and very oftentimes we're not taking time out to explain the alignment between what we're doing and what the organizational strategic intent might be. So taking the time to understand, where are we on the organizational train track? Are we on a completely different line, or is our line meeting at certain stations where we're creating value? The third one, and for me, this is what I would call probably the serial contributor to HR credibility. And it's the administrative complexity that we surround ourselves with. The complexity that we drive into our HR business processing, the complexity that surrounds our administration. Looking inside businesses, HR is the one function that typically gets bogged down with administration. So we have to stop and ask ourselves the question, what is that complexity, that administrative complexity that we have either inherited in our functions or we've caused within our functions? We have to ask ourselves the question, what is that doing to our operational efficiency? How is that administrative complexity getting us so bogged down to the point where, in many cases, it's causing an agility lag within our function? We're not able to swiftly, quickly respond to the needs of the business. And so many of us are now to the point where, which is a very positive thing, that HR are being asked to lead change within our businesses, to lead transformation within our businesses. But we have to stop and think about, what are those administrative complexities doing to our agility? And if we can't, if we're not swift enough and fast enough and agile enough in the business analytics that we're able to provide into the business in real time, if we're not, if we are getting bogged down with that administration, then we are causing lag. And this very oftentimes is why we're not asked to lead change within organizations, because we're not agile enough, because of those administrative complexibilities. And finally, and this is probably quite a contentious one for me to put up in front of a group of HR professionals in the room, but our obsession with creating positive people experience. We're obsessed with developing new initiatives, trying all the time to be the custodians and the guardians and the responsibles for people experience. That's the job of leaders. It's not the job of the HR function to create people experience. Now, we will touch on in a few minutes what we do inside the HR function, which impacts either positively or negatively on people experience. But we need to stop obsessing with feeling like we are the only function that's responsible for creating positive people experience. So in terms of looking at and analyzing what are causing the HR credibility gaps, instead of, I suppose, trying to constantly drive new initiatives in from a HR perspective, we need to start focusing and becoming much more obsessed with relentlessly keeping our eye on mastering the basics. So when I speak about mastering the basics, it comes back to the gaps that I've just identified. So there's only 3 things really that we need to remain obsessively focused on: align our priorities, ensure that the HR priorities, the HR metrics, that we can, as HR leaders, draw a straight line of sight between our priorities in HR and the priorities of the business. Second of all, secure operational excellence. So we need to be demanding the right processes. We need to be demanding the right technology. And as I've said here from the beginning, I'm not here to represent HR technology in any way, but try doing a major organizational or an enterprise-wide transformation without the right HR technology. And, how many of us in this room feel that we're operating with less than robust, less than, the strongest HR technology that you could have? How many people in the room are happy with their HR technology? Good, I'll be chatting to you. I hope you're using Core HR, by the way. So, HR technology, why as a function have we continued year on year, decade on decade, to accept substandards when it comes to technology and enterprise technology? you can be absolutely sure and certain that if I was standing here in front of a group of finance professionals, ask them are they happy with their technology, and we would have had a very different result in the room. So we need, as professionals of, and let's say, I suppose, setting the scene for the next HR generation coming after us, we need to be sure that we are insisting on having the right HR technology to secure that operational excellence. And we need to obviously ensure that we're passing the agility fitness test so that as a function, we're actually leading the change as opposed to chasing the change. For the last 3 years when I've presented, and the students particularly like this graph, I was anticipating that we would have some students from the university with us today, which is why I'm repeating and showing this chart. And really, I'm showing it in the context of the HR credibility gap. From the day we all stepped into our world of HR, our career evolutions have typically been the same right across the globe. We step into HR, we get those operational exposures, we maybe move into some cross-industry exposures where we decide to move from one industry to the other and we get additional HR context experience there. We move then, if we're lucky enough, we get some cross-cultural exposures from global roles that maybe we have targeted and secured. And from there, we get into the whole area of enterprise transformation. And over the next couple of days, we will have the joy of having Dr. Marshall Goldsmith with us, who is, of course, one of the top HR thought leaders. And moving from being change agents and transformation agents within our businesses, I've been lucky enough to get to work as the C-level strategist. I'm lucky that I've chosen organizations that respect the HR contribution at board level. And someday, maybe, we become the recognized thought leaders like Marshall Goldsmith. But why am I showing this chart? It's in the context of the HR credibility gap. I believe that your credibility has nothing to do with your tenure. It's nothing to do with your seniority. And as I say, I'm speaking specifically to the students here. It's got to do with how you're able to master those basics right through the career evolution that's relevant. Are we agile in producing analytics and people analytics? Am I able, as a HR leader, able to respond? Am I able to converse in the language of the business? Am I able to let my HR lingo outside the door when I go in and look at, let's say, an operational performance meeting? Am I able to articulate where I'm creating value as the HR leader? And so focusing on those basics is critical, irrespective of where you are on the HR career trajectory. And it's about hyperconnectivity. If we as a HR profession can hyperconnect into the organizational strategic intent of the business, first of all, do we understand the organizational strategic intent? Because if we don't, then we will constantly be in a different carriage on a different train track. So bridging the HR credibility gap starts with ensuring that we can draw that hyperconnectivity between HR language and the language of the business. It's dependent on us being able to draw a very clear line of sight between the HR metrics that we have running inside our functions and how they're measuring up against organizational performance. How relevant are they? And it's all about, if we can constantly, the word relevant for me in the HR world is extremely powerful, because the credibility gap comes back to us maybe first of all not understanding our own relevance inside the organization, or worse again, where we're trying to constantly explain our relevance to leaders in the business. We shouldn't be finding ourselves in those situations, because for as long as we do, we will forever have this HR credibility gap running around after us. And finally, operational excellence is connected to our fitness and agility. And if we can master these areas, these are the basics that we need to master in order, and you see the credibility gap and the graphic for that dissolves as we get more mature with this. And out of all of that, organically comes the positive employee experience, which comes back to my point that we shouldn't, as HR professionals, find ourselves having independent, separate employee experience initiatives going on. if we master the basics right that I've just shown in the last couple of slides, positive employee experience will come organically from that. So what are the HR credibility blockers? We've spoken a little bit about alignment. We've spoken a little bit about language. We've spoken a little bit about us, our agility and not able to respond and not able to stay up with the speed at which our organizations are changing. So very oftentimes we are perceived to be on that different train line, on that different underground. But we know as HR professionals that there are very critical junctures, there are very critical stations at which the work which we're doing inside of HR connects into generating value in our businesses. It's up to us as HR professionals to A, understand where are we creating that value, understand, how we're generating organizational value, and to be able to articulate to the business leaders within our organizations to stop, to take the time to stop at those stations and say, this is as a direct result. What has happened here in terms of this organizational metric, hopefully moving in a positive direction, this is as a direct result of what we've been doing in HR. It's as a direct result of us keeping an eye on that HR metric and us moving the dial on that HR metric. We need to identify these stations and we need to call these out as we're intersecting with the organization and we see value being created as a direct result of what we're doing in HR. Make sense? Okay. I'm under a little bit of pressure, so I'm going to hurry along. But the point here on this slide is that there will always be the inevitable disconnect. There will always be the initiative that we've heard about here at the HRD Congress that we might decide, that's a brilliant idea, I'm going to take that back into my own organization. And we hear about, we're probably one of the best functions in organizations to speak about best practice. How many of us speak about best practice? HR is the function that will always be speaking about best practice. It's my pet hate word in HR because best practice is only best practice if it aligns with what you're trying to achieve inside your own organization. It's completely down to organizational context. What might be considered a best practice, fantastic initiative for one organization may become quite disruptive in another organization if the context isn't right. So there will sometimes be that inevitable disconnect. And we've all fallen for this. I mean, I have a situation where I'm running 2 or 3 projects right now inside my own organization that I'm probably fairly quickly going to need to disband because it's not giving me the traction that I expected it to. And so in those times, it's having the courage to pull the plug early, say, you know what, we've tried this, we don't believe this is the right way to go, we're going to abandon this initiative until such time as the time is right, because guess what, it's not creating value right now in the current organizational context. So it's about all of the time, calibrating our directional compass. Where are we going? Do we need to recalibrate? Are we on that same line as the organization? Are we getting enough junctions and stations where we're creating value? It's about calibrating our speedometer. Are we going too quickly? Are we trying to change things too quickly? Can the organization digest what I'm imposing on the organization at this point in time? Or are we going too slowly because we're wrapped up in these administrative complexities that I've spoken about earlier? And it's all about calibrating our fitness to change lines as needed. So if you can keep in mind those train lines, are we intersecting often enough with the organization? Are we able to articulate the value we're generating and recalibrate where we're going on the different lines and we're not getting those value creation stations as we go? This is a little bit of research that I'm quickly going to share with you. It was done by Fosway Group in London, where they went out, they surveyed top HR professionals across a variety of industries who told them that their priorities were better leadership and management, being a strategic business partner, facilitating the digital transformations inside our organizations, improving engagement, and facilitating cultural change. This is what we've told the researchers as HR professionals. This is what our CEOs have told us, have told the same research companies. Our CEOs and top business leaders have said, I'm interested not about leadership development, not about cultural change. I'm interested about increasing performance and profitability. 58% of them gave that as their #1 priority. Increasing business agility, increasing customer satisfaction, reducing our operating costs, and regional business growth was very important to 38% of them. So when you look at the left-hand side of the page versus the right-hand side of the page, and feel free to take this, as I say, Fosway is a very credible research group in London. And this is what they've produced very recently. But as HR professionals, we can very clearly, and I'm sure if I went around the room and had time to ask you guys, we can, as HR professionals, draw very clear lines of sight between what we're doing on the left-hand side of the page and what the organization's priorities are on the right-hand side of the page. But guess what? We're probably not doing a very good job at translating why better leadership and management will feed profitability. Why, by improving employee engagement, we deliver, better operating costs, reducing our operating costs, increasing profitability. This is the translation that we need to make about what we're doing and how it's converting into the right side of the page. It's the value creation slide that I showed. And then the emergence of the fracture happens when we don't do that. When we're working on all these initiatives and we don't take the time out to evaluate and to see where are we creating those value junctions through the initiatives that we're doing. The bright spots are we have the proof of evidence, we have all of the research that we need, we have business recognition, and I can stand here as a CHRO and honestly say that if we do master the basics, and it took me a long time in my career to figure out that if I do these 2 or 3 things right, and I have my teams focusing on these 2 or 3 things, we do get business recognition. We do get that seat at the table. And business leaders have very high respect for HR functions that do master those basics. And the good news is that the HR credibility gap is very easy to fix. Our boosters, there's 2 or 3 things that we just need to be obsessed with outcome-based value. What are we doing? What value are we creating? And are we articulating for the organization the outcome-based value that we're generating as a direct result of the HR initiatives and focuses that we have going on inside our organizations? We need to translate the connections. We need to say the connection between this is what we're doing this leadership development program, we're churning out better leaders, we have, who are driving employee engagement, and we need, as HR professionals, to be able to look at a P&L, look at a balance sheet, and say, as a direct result of these initiatives, this is how this is showing up on the P&L. This is how this is showing up on the balance sheet of this company. And finally, having the technology, the right technology to put the headlights on what's important for leaders, not what's right for HR. People analytics belong to the leaders of the individuals. It doesn't belong to HR. But HR does need to insist on having the right technology to do that. So really what I'm saying is, and this is my second last slide, I have 5 minutes, great, I have 2 slides. So really, we just, from a HR perspective, we need to be holding the mirror up to ourselves a little bit more. We need to be asking ourselves the questions, when folks are talking about the HR credibility gap, do they have, do they have the right to be saying that? And in many cases, they absolutely do, because we're not translating for them, we're not helping them to understand, we're not drawing clear lines between what we're doing and how the organization is performing. And so we need to just look at our alignment. Are we on the same destination journey? Are our lines going in the same direction? That train line, that underground, are we going in that same direction? Our ways, how we function as a HR team, what we impose on leaders in terms of demands for performance reviews or getting involved in interviews and all of the administrative things, Are we making ourselves easy to do business with inside our organizations? Or are we that nightmare function that drives complexity into everything we do? So really, I suppose, asking ourselves the question, are we operationally a hindrance, or are we an accelerant inside our businesses? And this is really holding the mirror up and doing that due diligence, doing that audit of ourselves as a function to see how would I score if I was to be assessed on these fronts. Our speed, are we leading the change or are we chasing the change? And finally, our people. What type of experience is our people having as a result of our ways of working, as a result of the alignment that HR has with the rest of the business, as a result of the speed that we're going at internally? And it is all about the people. Many of us have changed our job titles from human resources manager, human resources director to, people experience director. I've changed my organization, my board changed my own title from CHRO to CPO just a couple of months to, I suppose, signify into the business the importance that my organization places in its people. And I have one personal motto that I share at every conference, every event that I speak with. I either start with this or I finish with this, because for me, it is people who create all value in all businesses. Not your product, not your product, it's your people who create the value and generate the value for the board members, stakeholders of organizations. And so that ends the presentation. If there's anybody that wants to talk to me, I'm hanging around here for a little while afterwards. And again, I thank the Congress for the opportunity to speak at the 28th HRD Congress. So thank you very much.